Welcome. Thank you for watching First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. We are in our 25th year. Each month, we share firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self-identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our program, please send us your questions and let us know where you are joining from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Irene Weiss share her firsthand account of survival with us. Irene, thank you for joining us and for agreeing to be our first person.
Thank you for asking me.
And Irene, you have so much to share with us in a very short period of time, just 1 hour. We'll go ahead and start. Irene, you were born on November 21st, 1930 in Botraj, Czechoslovakia, now Ukraine. Please tell us about your hometown and your parents, Meyer and Leah Fogel.
Yeah, so we lived in a small town, a farming town of a population a little over 1,000. It was a nice, comfortable childhood, going to school, playing with the neighborhood kids, remembering all our religious holidays, which were special events for our family. And in general, life was easy and no big problems for children.
Tell us about this photo we're about to see.
Okay. So this is my mother, Leah. Mm-hmm. She's about 30, 40 years old this time. The baby is me, so it's 1930. On the left side is my sister, Serena, who's about 4 years old. On the right side is my little brother, Moshe, and he's probably less than 3 years old.
And we have another photo of your siblings. Will you tell us about this picture as well?
Yes. So this is Serena, somewhat older, and two little brothers. On the left side, Ruane, he's about 4 or 5, and Gershon, the little one, around 3.
Mm. Irene, how large was the Jewish community in your hometown?
A very small community of 10 families, and they were really, it was a town of farming, as I said, and typically the Jewish families didn't own any land, so they were not very well-to-do, and most of the families were either having a small business like a mom and pop front door store, or they were people like tailors, shoemakers, carpenters, and people who could use their skills to work in the community. So it was a really small, not very wealthy town. My father had a small lumber business, and it seemed to me in retrospect that he did a little better, and that we were a little better off than some of the other families.
Irene, what can you tell us about relationships your family had with other neighbors and members of this community?
So, of course, it's very obvious that we were Jewish, and we didn't go to the church, and we went to the synagogue, and we were a somewhat different group, but there was not any anti-Semitism outright. My mother would chat with the neighbors, and we children played with each other. it was a quiet relationship, but obviously knowing that we were somewhat different.
We have another photo. Tell us about this photo, Irene.
Okay. So this was taken in the home of the person standing the tallest in her house. There was someone taking pictures, and we were delighted to pose. So I am the circle around me, and next to me is my sister Edith. She's maybe 2 years younger than I. And behind me is Serena, about 4 years older. And the young lady, her name is Bella Klarman. And the little boy in the center is actually her brother. And she was a lovely person. She did survive the Holocaust. The little boy, of course, didn't.
Irene, in late 1938, everything changed for you and your family when your community was occupied by Hungary, a future ally of Nazi Germany. Tell us how your lives changed once you were under Hungarian rule.
Yes, it did indeed change, because there was a steady stream of propaganda that came out of the radio and from other people who were picked up the slogans against the Jews. And there would be young, I would call them hoodlums, who would put on a swastika band on their arm and felt entitled. They became the law. And they could roam around in villages and towns and commit vandalism, pull out a Jewish person from the home and use it as someone that they could do whatever they wanted to. The police stood by and watched all kinds of harm done to homes, to synagogues. And in general, there was a feeling of fear, because the police no longer protected us. The law no longer protected us. So there was a lot of fear, and for good reason, that we were vulnerable.
What happened to your father's lumber business?
Well, pretty soon after, my father's lumber business was confiscated and given to a non-Jew. And other Jewish families who had businesses, they were all confiscated. My father stayed home, didn't leave the house anymore to go to the business, and there was no more income. And of course, we didn't know how long it would last. But basically, he was helping in taking care of the children and the household, helping my mother. But we didn't know how long this would last, or it's very scary.
And for you, Irene, were you able to continue your schooling?
For a short period, we were still allowed to go to the Hungarian schools, but soon after, the law changed so that Jewish children were not allowed to attend Hungarian schools, just like Jewish professionals, teachers, doctors, all kinds of other professionals also lost their livelihood, and because Jews were not allowed to function as professionals or children in school. So we were also unable to attend Hungarian schools anymore.
You shared with me before that you had a very frightening experience with your father on a train. Would you tell us about that?
Yes. So my father and I were coming home from a neighboring town. The train trip would last no more than 5 minutes. And as the train began to move, with two young teenagers, two hoodlums, I heard them speaking among each other, saying, "What shall we do with that Jew sitting there? And wouldn't it be fun to throw him off?" And they were laughing and encouraging each other to see how they can decide on what to do with that Jew sitting there. And then, of course, they stood up and came and approached my father, who was sitting there. And again, it was a lot of fun and laughter. And the people, other passengers, nobody said a word. Nobody said, "Stop it," nothing like that. And of course, I was left alone, somehow ignored. But of course, I heard all this, and I saw the great danger that unless we get to our destination in time, they will indeed throw him off the train. So I was very, very scared, very frightened. So kept looking out the window to see the terrain, how close we were to home. And apparently my father too was looking out. And so since it was a very short time ride, we did arrive at our station and got off. And if it had been a little bit of a longer trip, I am sure they would have thrown him off the train. Mm-hmm. So my father and I were both very badly shaken and very, very scared and frightened of what just happened.
Thanks for telling us about that, Irene. Before we go on, I'd like you to know that we have people watching and listening to you today from a lot of different places. From across the United States, we have people watching from Arkansas, Minnesota, Idaho, and Colorado. And we have people tuning in today from France, Canada, Slovakia, Chile, and South Africa. So thanks to all of you out there watching Irene today. I'd also like to share a comment from a viewer named Wendy. Wendy asks, did you question why others just stood by and watched the brutality and persecution?
They watched it because it was not against the law. They could escalate it. They could do whatever they wanted to a Jew, since we were no longer covered by the law.
And as you said, the police just stood by in those circumstances.
Yes. And there were a lot of skirmishes between young people in the streets, and the police stood by and watched.
Irene, World War II began in September 1939 when Nazi Germany attacked Poland. During the war, Hungary required tens of thousands of Jewish men to do forced labor for their military. Your father was conscripted into forced labor in 1942. Tell us about your father's mandatory labor service and what that meant for your family.
Yes. Well, the Jewish young men were called into this labor brigade, and they were taken onto the front line of the war. They were not given weapons. They were not considered soldiers. They did that very dangerous work a lot in the front line. Many of them were killed. Many of them were badly hurt. They were not treated with respect, and most of them never came back. We were very lucky to have our father come back after about 6 months. We don't quite understand why they allowed him to come, but he did come back, and he told us some of the terrible experience and dangerous work and humiliation that they experienced and by being in great danger on the front line without being able to defend yourself. So in the meantime, he sat at home without any income and really worried about leaving the home or show himself in public so that he wouldn't have experiences of the dangerous experiences out in the world.
Irene, as difficult as life was, as you've described, for Jews under the Hungarians and their rule, it turned tragically worse in March 1944 when Nazi Germany invaded Hungary. Tell us how your life changed under Nazi occupation once they were in.
Well, the Nazi occupation, it was a level of hatred and anti-Semitism that surpassed what happened up to that point. Within the Nuremberg type laws that the Germans used against the Jews in other occupied countries now happened to us. Jews could not keep their professions, children couldn't go to schools. The propaganda against Jews, telling the public around the clock that all their problems were created by the Jews and that they were enemies of the state and that they were not loyal citizens and that they were not reliable, and they were telling secrets of the country to the enemy countries. In other words, they were blaming the Jews who were not totally suppressed and hiding in their homes. Nevertheless, they were blaming them from all the problems that the Germans experienced in the war and all the other problems that the local population experienced due to the war. And so there was a huge upheaval of anti-Semitism, hatred, and difficult time for every family in every aspect of life.
And Irene, it wouldn't be long before you were forced from your home. Tell us about being forced from your home and where you were taken.
Yes. So 2 weeks after the occupation of Hungary by the Nazi Germans, we were notified that all the Jews in our town should prepare to leave their home with one suitcase each and report to a gathering place. We were not told our destination. We didn't know why we're being expelled from our home. But when the time came, they said that it was right after the last day of Passover in April, and my mother began to cook and bake so that we would be able to take some food for the 6 children. And they began to pack a suitcase. And I remember the difficulties that they had about deciding what to take when you leave your home. They would open a suitcase, put something in it, decide it wasn't important enough, take it out, open it, bring something else, put it in there. Same routine. They didn't know what to take, what to leave. They ended up that basically they just took as much of the food that was in the house or was possible, and some basic clothing. Then the next day, a delegation came to our home from the policeman and even my school principal. And they took my father aside and said that you have to give us all your money and valuables. And the demand was escalating when he said that we don't have much of that. He has been unemployed for a long time. That they insisted and they demanded that before he leaves, he's to give them all his valuables and money. And so he gave them some things like basic, wedding bands, a watch, and just simple things like that, and some cash. And so they left, and then we had to walk out with our suitcases from our home, close the door, so the gate, that the dog wouldn't follow us, and walked up to this gathering place. And there, when we got there, the 10 Jewish families with all their children, but also coming into this place and settling into the floor of this building, and everybody took a corner with their belongings and children, and nobody told us where we're going or why we were removed from our home and what our fate will be. So soon after that, some horse and wagons arrived, and they put us into the horse and wagons. Again, didn't take us our destination. We were entirely at the disposal of their plan, and they drove the 10 families with several horse and buggies to the nearest city, which was called Munkács. And the place they took us to was an abandoned brick factory that was on the outskirts of the town, and they dropped us off there. And we realized that this was a place where hundreds of families were being dropped off from the neighboring towns and villages, and that the population was just growing. Nobody could see what facility they had here for so many people and children and age groups. And we were abandoned there and got into the factory, the old abandoned factory. And again, in some of those barracks, but before were stored bricks, that was our home. Everybody took a place on the floor. My parents just sat down, spread out a blanket, and that became our space. And soon it was filled with people, hundreds and hundreds of people and children, until you had to step over people to go in and out of this place. And more people, and there was no facility for families. There were no bathrooms, there were no kitchens, there was no place for sleeping, for food. It was just people on top of each other, families with children and sick people. It was a devastating experience. Mm-hmm. And we realized that we're in big trouble, but still felt that this is not sustainable, and that they will just, after a while, they'll have enough of this nonsense and they'll just let us go back home. We really never thought that this is just the beginning of the expulsion and the moving us further. We really never thought that it was anything like that. But of course, that was the next step.
Irene, before we go to that, I'd like to share a comment from Jamie, who is watching live today. Jamie writes that you are able to speak your truth and to communicate the pain and the warnings time and time again throughout the years is courageous and generous. Thank you for your selflessness. Thank you. That's from Jamie. And
Well, it is very important to tell the story so that people will understand what hate and lies can change people and cause such pain to their neighbors.
Irene, before we go on, I'd like to just remind our audience that if you have questions of Irene, and we hope that you do, please communicate them through the chat feature. In less than a 2-month period, a staggering number of Jews were from across Hungary, nearly 440,000 people were rounded up and deported, mostly to Auschwitz concentration camp and killing center. After 3 weeks in the Munkaj brick factory ghetto that you just described, you and your family were deported. Please tell us about leaving the ghetto and arriving at Auschwitz.
Yes, well, after this unbelievable hardship of living on the floor and depending on a soup ration, there was an announcement that we should pack up our things and leave the place and head for the tracks, the railroad that was adjacent to this place, and that we should all get into the cattle trains. The shock of feeling that we're leaving this was incredibly upsetting, because we did think that somehow we will go back home after a while, and that they're threatening to take us out of here further. And we were extremely concerned. Where are we going? Where are they taking us? So we had heard rumors about what the Nazis were doing to Jews in Poland, and that we heard that they were killing Jews by firing squads. We never heard of Auschwitz up to now, or even later, and that we did hear that in occupied Poland, the villages were, the Jews in the villages were destroyed by firing squads, killed, and the synagogues were burned down, and that we didn't believe that. We felt that it cannot be that bad, and that we felt that after all, that was Poland, and we are not in Poland. And in other words, we dismissed all those stories that were actually true, because it was too incredible to believe. However, now that we were being asked to get into cattle trains and they're taking us further, people were talking about how it must be that we are going to be being taken to Poland, and that when we get there, we will be facing a firing squad, because that is what we heard that attempted to deny. And so there was a great deal of fear and anxiety, of course. So we got into, they rushed us into the trains, the cattle trains, huge number of people packed in, 80 to 100 in the cattle train. And the whole experience was done with brutality of hurry up and get in there, and they were practically chasing us into the train. We tried very hard to stay together, the family, and get into the same cattle train, and managed to do that. And again, we took my parents took a place on the floor, and that became our place. The feeling of terror was indescribable. What will happen to the children? What will happen to us? So once the train was filled and was locked from the outside, and after a day or two of waiting for it to move until they were finished loading the train began to move, and my father was looking out that little window of the cattle train, and he told everyone at one point that the train made a turn towards Poland, and the rumors we heard seemed to have come to pass. At that point, when he announced that there was total silence in the cattle train, even the children were silent. It was just total terror as to what will happen when the doors open, that we will indeed be in some forest, in some fields in Poland, and mowed down by a firing squad. So it was indescribable silence.
And then you got to Auschwitz at some point.
And then, of course, the train arrived in a place that didn't seem to be exactly what we thought would happen. And in a way, my father again looked out before the doors opened, and he said, "I see barracks. Mm-hmm. This is not the forest and a firing squad. This looks like a labor camp, a work camp." And everybody quieted down and felt, they said, well, we can work if that's what it is. And then the doors opened, and they began to yell and shout orders, get out, and leave everything behind. And there was great rush and great urgency to get out fast. And as soon as we heard that, and we heard get out and leave everything behind. So that was an additional shock, that we're not taking any of our belongings or any kind of identification or anything. So people were rushed out of the trains, and as soon as we were on the platform, more orders for what to do. Men line up to one side, women and children line up to the other side on the platform, and the crowds were out in minutes, and the men lined up in a big group on one side, and the women and children, and as the platform filled up with people, the women and children began to move. We didn't know, the movement. There was no telling us where we're going or what is going on. But at one point, our family was up front, and we first time realized that we were being separated. There were at least a dozen Nazi soldiers blocking our way, and one of them held a stick, and with that stick he pointed to left or right in the direction that he wanted people to go. And this picture can show you the system there. The large group there is the men and boys who lined up waiting for the next movement. The small group is the remnant of the women and children who had already gone through the separation. And when they finish with the women's group, then they will separate the men also into who will live and who will die. Of course, we don't understand that or can't even imagine that.
Irene, if I could jump in for just a minute. This photo is from a remarkable and deeply disturbing collection of photographs called the Auschwitz album. These photographs were taken by Nazi officials on the same day that your family arrived at Auschwitz. And you, Irene, you are circled, you are in the photograph we're looking at, and you're circled in the lower left-hand side. Tell us more about this photograph. That's you, that's your family. Tell us about that.
So my family had just gone through the separation at the front of the line of women and children. So first, my sister Serena was motioned to one side. Next, my mother and two little boys were motioned to go to the other side. I was standing there with my sister Edith, who was about 2 years younger than me, and the stick came down between us, and she was sent towards where our mother went, and I was sent towards where my older sister went. And I was absolutely stunned and terrified that she was taken from me, and we were holding hands, because the crowds moving in the direction that she was sent was a huge number of people, and that even in the few seconds that it took, I realized that my mother with the two little boys were already out of sight, and more people were being rushed in that direction, women and children and elderly, and that she will not catch up with them. And I just couldn't understand what happened. I thought I somehow should have held on to her. I somehow should have not let her go, and was very confused, because I thought my little sister will be among strangers and won't catch up. And even if we think it's a labor camp and women and children will not be working, of course, that's the foolish idea we had, she will never catch up with them. And so I lingered for a while and looked over to the side to see if I can see her catch up. It was impossible. And after this shock of losing her, I felt I lost her. And there's something very wrong here, that women and children and elderly are not being kept. That nobody asked our name, nobody has any documents. There's something very strange here. And anyhow, I was my first enormous shock and absolute disbelief that I was left there alone, not knowing what is going to happen to my little sister. It was terrifying and just confusion. After a few seconds of me standing there, I was motioned to go in the direction where my older sister went. And so I did. And each group was sent on a different road where they were designated. So I was now on a road with a bunch of young adults, and my sister.
But you're with Serena at this time.
Serena.
Yeah.
No, I was yelling after her, saying, "Serena, wait for me, wait for me." And she finally heard me, turned around, and she says, "Why didn't you go with Mom?" And I was starting to babble about Edith. She'll never catch up with our mother. I don't know what happened. What will happen to Edith? I was in a state of panic. And then I was swept off with the young adults, and a different fate for us. And my mother, with elderly women and grandmothers, were all on the road that led to the gas chamber. And of course, we didn't know that, because we had this sort of idea that, yes, it makes sense that women and children will be separate because this is a labor camp. So we're very badly mistaken. They were, within the next half hour or an hour, all of them were dead. All of them were gassed. All of them were killed.
Irene, we have another photo from that horrible collection of photographs from the day your family was sent to Auschwitz. Tell us what we see here.
So in this picture that was taken by Nazi soldiers for their own purposes, we see a group of women and children waiting in a wooded area, sitting there. What they don't know at all, can't even imagine, that they are waiting their turn to enter the gas chamber. This is maybe a half hour or an hour since they got out of the train. And I see in this picture my two little brothers, Ruvain and Gershon, about 10 years old and 8 years old, and sitting down next to them, the profile is my mother sitting there with them. They have no idea what they're waiting for. Sometimes they were told that they were going to take a shower. But as you see, they are relaxed and not frightened, because they can't imagine that it's not going to be a shower. But they are waiting their turn to enter the gas chamber. And the reason they had to wait is because when the Hungarian Jewish population was dumped into Auschwitz, the 4 gas chambers and crematoriums could not keep up with the killing and the gassing and the crematorium. So they had to wait their turn until there was an opening for them. And that's what they're doing. They're minutes away from the gas chamber, but they have absolutely no idea. Later, I was able to understand this picture when we realized what really was happening to the women and children upon arrival. They were killed immediately, and the next train arrived, and the next train, and the next train. Something like 114 cattle trains from Hungary arrived in Auschwitz and dumped their women and children.
As we noted earlier, almost 440,000 individuals in that short time. Irene, we have a video question from a student, Nate, in Rockville, Maryland. I'll repeat the question after Nate finishes. Let's go ahead and hear from Nate.
Hi, my name is Nate Weinstein, and I'm from Rockville, Maryland. In the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, what was your relationship with your sister Serena like? Were you two able to help one another endure the difficulties of life in the camp?
Nate asks, Irene, what he asks is, in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, what was your relationship with your sister Serena like? Were you two able to help each other endure the difficulties of life in the camp?
Oh, yes. I mean, to have someone, a sister, a relative, to be, belong to someone. To me, I was very, very frightened every minute I was in Auschwitz, because my family was torn apart. We were experiencing strange events of being processed and transformed from human beings to some kind of animals. And I was very, very frightened to have my sister with me. And was definitely, it was very, very important for me to have family, to have someone that I belonged to. And so, yes, we helped each other, we supported each other, and I particularly would not have survived if I had been left alone. It was just too much like a world that had recognized nothing normal, nothing understandable. So
Irene,
yes.
a remarkable thing did happen for you and Serena, and that is, amazingly, you actually came across two aunts who were also there, your Aunt Piri and your Aunt Rose. And so together, there were the four of you, and you ended up working, the four of you ended up put to work forced labor in a part of Auschwitz known as Canada. And we have a photograph of that, and I'd like you, if you would, tell us what this was.
Yes, we did by accident meet my mother's two young sisters, and again, their support, their protection of me and Serena helped us survive, because this was a place that was terrifying and subhuman in every way. So eventually we were sorted out and assigned to work, and we in that particular group were assigned to a place where all the belongings from all the many trains were dumped and into a very special place that Germans were collecting everything that people brought with them and wanted it for them and for their German population. So when the trains were emptied with the belongings that people brought, it was brought to this special place where there were quite a few barracks. Right now, what we're looking at is shoes that came out of the many trains. And the shoes, the roof of the barrack, you could see that the shoes are higher than the roof of the barrack. We were about 1,000 women were assigned to work on all the other belongings that came out of the train. There was every kind of item people brought, clothing and suitcases and pots and pans and eyeglasses and toothbrushes and baby carriages and every kind of belonging that people thought that would help them to bring or needed to bring in the trains was dumped here. And the 1,000 women were working day and night on shifts to bring it into cover inside the barrack out of the weather, and then to separate it according to type and take off labels and package it to be shipped to Germany for the German people. So we could never get ahead of the job because the trains kept coming and unloading things day and night. And it took us months just to get the stuff inside under the roof, and then continued to sit on the floor and continue to sort and repackage all this. We also discovered soon enough that the clothing and belongings from the people from the gas chambers were also brought here, added to the belongings from the people.
Irene, just I think for everybody watching, trying to imagine that that's just a mountain of just shoes that are taken from all those who've gone to Auschwitz, and most of whom have been murdered. Together with your sister and your two aunts, you remained in Auschwitz under horrific circumstances for 8 months. In January 1945, as Soviet troops advanced, the Nazis evacuated Auschwitz. After being forced to march to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, you ended up at the Neustadt Gleva camp near Hamburg, Germany. Please tell us a little bit, if you can, about the 5 months that you spent there.
Yes, so the Russian army was approaching the Auschwitz area, and so yes, the Germans evacuated the prisoners and forced us on a out and on a death march in January, the cold and snow, and we were just walking day and night without any food, water. We ate the snow on the ground, kept moving, and if you sat down, you were shot. If you leaned on someone, you were shot. There were dead people along the edges of the road, and it was very, very cold and very, very snowy. So eventually we ended up deep in Germany, out of Poland, into a camp that was already there, filled with some people, but they dumped us there. And because the Germans were really at this point losing the war and kind of retreating, they no longer had some of the system to regiment the prisoners the way they did before, and they actually stopped feeding us. They stopped even giving us the meager rations that we had before, and typhus broke out. People were dying, but the Germans continued one thing they were so good at. They would come with trucks, and this place didn't have a gas chamber, so they had a system of truck coming in daily and pick out the sick ones, the ones with typhus, pick out the ones who were already skin and bones because of a lack of food, and take them to Ravensbrück, a camp that did have a gas chamber. So my aunt, one of my aunts, Pearl, she got caught typhus because we watched her being loaded on the truck one day with many others, and she was gone and killed. My other aunt became very, very sick with pneumonia. She was lying on the floor with a high fever, and my sister and I thought that she won't make it. She'll be next. And very, very, very upset about what was happening to us. But basically, we were on a starvation diet here. Mm-hmm. So both Serena and I were simply starving for the best part of 5 months and lost a lot of weight and was very desperate situation. Starvation is painful, very, very painful. And one thing the Germans never stopped is just keep selecting people for killing, especially the ones who were sick and couldn't work anymore. So one day they selected Serena to be taken to the gas chamber because she was skin and bones. And I was that way too, but at this point, it was Serena, and I said, I understand the situation that my two aunts, one was gone, one is to be next, and that I would be left alone. And I thought to myself, who will I belong to if Serena is also taken? And so I said, I am her sister. They said, well, you can go too. So they put us in a special place with many other women that they had selected, awaiting the truck that came regularly to take us to the place that had, in Ravensbrück, that had the gas chamber. And after a whole day, we were locked in there. Nobody said a word. All of us knew our fate. But by that time, we were so weak and had starved literally for so many weeks that our thinking about survival was, or to fight for it, or was sort of gone. I think when one experiences starvation, what happened to me, your entire focus is revolved around that food of the sky, wanting that, and that suddenly you can't think of anything else, not of your parents, not of your situation. It's just a very, very painful for the body to experience that. And so it seemed to me that it'll be best if we both just die at this point. Now, what happened is that because the Russian army was approaching further and deeper into that area of Germany, that the truck that day did not arrive because of the war situation on the highway. At the end of, because we didn't know that until later, that the truck wasn't coming, but at the end of the day, the truck didn't arrive and the door was open, and we just, all of us walked out and back into our original places. And a day or two after, the guard towers were empty. The Germans left, and the Russian army, some members of the army, came into the camp, and we realized that we were free.
And so that was your liberation.
That's what our liberation.
Irene, we have another photo. Here's a photo of your sister Serena with you in the middle and your Aunt Rose, taken about 2 months after your liberation. Following your liberation, you made it back to the family home. Can you just briefly tell us what that was like for you when you went back to your home?
Well, this was a few months after we had already, after liberation, we all had put on a little weight. We were we made our way to Prague, Czechoslovakia, after we were liberated, but we were very far from Prague, and there was no transportation. There was no way to get out of there. And my Aunt Rose was very sick. We were weak. There was no transportation whatsoever. So we were walking and hitchhiking on the road. As we'd get to a town, we would put the sick ones into the hospital in whatever town we were at, and wait a couple of days until they rested a little. There was no medication or anything. And then we'd take them out because we had to get going. We had to get out of there. And so it took us weeks to get to Prague. It was a very terrible ordeal because we basically walked and hitchhiked, and we certainly were not capable of doing that. And many times we stopped and took the sickest ones into the hospital, but as I say, not for long periods, because we just had to get out of there.
And despite all of that, you just pressed on and you eventually got to your home.
And eventually made it. But our liberation, unfortunately, caused the death of many who had survived up to that point, because the Russian army abandoned us because, for those who came by our camp because of the typhus, they didn't want to enter, and we were abandoned. There was no food, there was no hospital, there was no transportation, and unfortunately, so many who made it up to that point died in the attempt of leaving. So eventually we did make it to Prague and began to search for survivors, because there were lists of names put up on buildings and various places of people searching, do you know so and such a person? Did you ever spend time in a camp with such and such a person? Trying to connect people who survived. There was a search of if anybody knew your whereabouts or you were with them for a certain time, there was some information and hope. So there was months of sorting out and taking account of the devastation, realizing that if they weren't on a list or they didn't show up, they never will.
Irene, you eventually did make it to your home, and just before we get ready to close the program, you shared with me that when you actually entered your home that you'd grown up in as a little girl, that was the first time you actually cried.
Yes, it was all the experiences were not the kind that one would get relief from crying. Crying is for normal experiences, pain or death, but this was beyond crying. We were petrified and stunned, and our feelings, tears didn't come. So yes, I went into my home. I was with a friend from our town, and yes, there was a family living there with children. They knew exactly who I was, although we never met. And yes, I went through every room from one to the other, so made a circle. They stood to one side and didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything. I didn't want the house back. I didn't say that I wanted the house back. I just wanted to see if there was anything left that was ours and familiar. So I found nothing except in one bedroom there was kind of a wallpaper on the wall that my mother had put some years ago on. I came out of the house and went down into the garden. We had a very large garden and a sort of an orchard. So went down to the orchard, and it was in the fall where the fruit was ripe and trees were full of fruit. And I just, all of a sudden, the tears began to come, because there, my family was gone. The trees were bearing the fruit. The fruit was ready to eat and be picked. I didn't want that, nothing even that. Just walked back out. Yes, I broke down in tears. And there was just a reaction from the fruit lived, but not the people.
Irene, I wish that we had all afternoon with you, because there's so much I know that you haven't been able to tell us. 2 years after this, after you returned to your home, 2 years later in 1947, you and your sister Serena were able to come to the United States with the help of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS. I wish we had more time for you to tell us about all that happened in that intervening time, including coming to the United States, being able to come here, coming here. But I do have one more question for you, Irene, and that is, as we face a dangerous surge in anti-Semitism, please tell us why you feel it is important to share your firsthand account of the Holocaust, what you went through, and what people can learn from it.
So when I was a child in Auschwitz, I thought that when this nightmare was over, there would be no more anti-Semitism. As we know, that did not happen. Propaganda and lies by government accusing a minority of causing the problems in the world that has a devastating effect that leads to hate and violence. The Holocaust is the tragic outcome when anti-Semitism and lies are not challenged.
Irene, thank you for those final words. Thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for your willingness to continuously share what you and your family experienced. There's no substitute for your firsthand account. And I hope that you are able to continue to tell your story for many, many, many more times. Thank you so much for being our first person, Irene.
Well, thank you for listening to my story. Thank you very much.
I would like to take just a moment to thank our donor. First Person is made possible through the generous support from the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to invite you to join us in September for another First Person program. Thank you for being with us today.